What if I told you one of the most difficult questions in the entire Bible isn't about creation, heaven, or hell, but about genocide? Yes. The question almost no one wants to face. How could a loving God command his people to utterly destroy an entire nation? The Canaanites. Men, women, children. Entire cities burned to the ground. It seems brutal, merciless, unexplainable. Skeptics call it proof that the Bible's God is cruel. Believers sometimes avoid the subject altogether. But what if the reason was something far deeper, something so dark, so twisted, that unless God acted, humanity itself would have been destroyed? The Bible tells us the land of Canaan was not just occupied, it was infected. But to understand why God gave the command he did, we have to first understand, who were these people? The Canaanites lived in one of the most fertile and desirable lands in the ancient world. Their cities were advanced. Their culture was rich. From the outside, they looked like a strong, thriving civilization. But behind their temples and festivals lay a darkness so deep it makes the stomach turn. They worshipped gods with strange names. Baal, the storm god. Asherah, the goddess of fertility. And most horrifying of all, Molech, the god who demanded fire sacrifices. Archaeology has uncovered shrines filled with burnt bones of infants, charred remains offered to Molech in fire. Their religion was built on the blood of children. Imagine this: drums beating, priests chanting, parents placing their newborns into the arms of a burning metal idol, believing that killing their child would bless their crops. This was not just idol worship. It was the most extreme corruption of life itself. But it didn't stop there. Their worship often included ritual prostitution, men and women degrading themselves in the name of the gods. They engaged in witchcraft, sorcery, and summoning of spirits. They believed blood had mystical power, and they shed it freely. The land of Canaan wasn't just full of sin. It was full of something more, something darker. The Bible uses a haunting phrase in Leviticus 18, verse 25. The land became defiled, so I punished it for its sin, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. Think about that. The land itself was sick, as if creation couldn't tolerate the evil that had spread across it. But here's the real question. Was this just about morality? If it was only about sin, then why were the Canaanites singled out in such an extreme way? Why not other nations who also worshipped idols? There must have been more, something hidden beneath the surface. When Israel approached the borders of Canaan, spies were sent to scout the land. What they saw terrified them. They reported in Numbers 13, "The people there are giants. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." Giants? The Anakim? Where did they come from? The Israelites weren't just facing another tribe. They were facing something unnatural, something that didn't fit the normal flow of humanity. The Canaanites weren't simply sinful neighbors. They were a nation steeped in blood rituals, perversion, and, if the scriptures are taken seriously, an unnatural corruption that stretched back to the earliest pages of Genesis. And here's the chilling truth. Unless God stepped in, Israel, the chosen nation through whom salvation would one day come, would have been swallowed alive. But what exactly was this corruption? Why did the Bible describe the inhabitants as giants? And what does it all have to do with the days of Noah? Numbers 13:33 records the spies' fearful words. "We saw the Nephilim there. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes." Wait, Nephilim? That name should sound familiar, because it doesn't start in Canaan. It goes all the way back to Genesis 6, the days before the flood. Genesis 6 verse 4 tells us, "The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them." In other words, there was a time when spiritual beings corrupted humanity, producing hybrids, giant offspring that were never meant to exist. And in Noah's day, the world was filled with violence, bloodshed, and corruption. So God cleansed the earth with a flood, but notice the chilling phrase, "and also afterward." Somehow, this corruption reappeared after the flood. And when Israel reached the land of Canaan, they found the descendants of that ancient corruption waiting for them. The Bible gives names to these giant tribes: Anakim, Deuteronomy 9 verse 2, Rephaim, Deuteronomy 2 verse 11, Amorites described as tall as cedars, Amos 2 verse 9. These weren't just tall men. The descriptions suggest something far more terrifying. Deuteronomy 3 verse 11 mentions King Og of Bashan, whose bed was made of iron and measured over 13 feet long. The Israelites weren't walking into a fair fight. They were walking into a nightmare, an infestation of giants tied to a corruption that stretched back to the days of Noah. But why does this matter? Why does the Bible go out of its way to mention these details? Because this explains why God's command was so absolute. You see, the conquest of Canaan wasn't about Israel seizing new land. It was about God cleansing corruption from his creation, removing a cancer that threatened to devour the entire story of salvation. Remember in Leviticus 18 when God said the land was vomiting out its inhabitants? This wasn't poetic exaggeration. It was the language of something unnatural. The Canaanites had opened doors to dark spiritual forces. Their blood sacrifices weren't just ritual, they were invitations. By sacrificing children, they were binding themselves to spiritual powers of death. Their cities became centers of darkness. Their culture became a trap. And the giants among them symbolized what had gone horribly wrong with creation itself. It wasn't just about sin anymore. It was about survival, human survival. Now imagine what would have happened if Israel didn't obey. The Canaanites weren't just bad neighbors. They were a contagious infection. Their practices, their gods, their spiritual corruption, it would spread like fire. In fact, God warned Israel again and again, do not follow their ways. Do not intermarry with them. Do not adopt their gods. But tragically, Israel often failed. And whenever they let Canaanite practices slip into their own worship, destruction followed, over and over again. This shows us that God's command wasn't senseless cruelty. It was desperate protection. Without his intervention, Israel, the very people chosen to bring the Messiah, would have been wiped out both physically and spiritually. But this raises the ultimate question: if giants were roaming Canaan, if corruption had survived the flood, and if God had to command such extreme measures, then where did this corruption really come from? What was the true agenda behind the Canaanites, their gods, and their giants? And most shocking of all, is there a chance that this ancient corruption might still be at work in the world today? The giants of Canaan weren't random. They were a targeted infestation. The child sacrifices weren't coincidence. They were strategic offerings. The corruption of the land wasn't natural. It was engineered spiritual warfare. The destruction of the Canaanites was not about race. It was about preservation. God was protecting the world's only hope, Jesus Christ. Let's name them. Molech, god of fire, demanding child sacrifice. Baal, god of storms and fertility, worshipped through prostitution and blood. Ashtoreth, goddess of lust, tied to orgies and sorcery. Behind these names weren't harmless myths. Behind them were fallen powers, ancient spiritual rebels masquerading as gods, craving worship, blood, and the corruption of humanity. And the land of Canaan was their stronghold. To destroy the Canaanites was to tear down a demonic empire. Now, pause for a second. Imagine Israel refusing to fight. Imagine them living side by side with giants, adopting Molech's practices, letting Baal worship blend with their faith. Do you see it? The Messiah's line would be extinguished. The plan of salvation would collapse before it began. God's judgment on Canaan wasn't cruelty. It was mercy for the entire world. But here's the haunting twist. The story doesn't end in Canaan. Throughout history, these same patterns reappear. Different names, different nations, but the same spiritual fingerprints. Child sacrifice reappears under new guises. Sexual perversion is celebrated as freedom. Violence, bloodshed, and occult practices spread across cultures. The War of Canaan was just one battle in a cosmic war that has never stopped. Now here is the truth that chills the bones. If God judged the Canaanites for their corruption, if he burned down their cities and uprooted their culture, what does that say about our world today? Are we not seeing the same signs? Innocent blood being shed on a global scale. A culture obsessed with violence and perversion. The rise of occult practices dressed up as entertainment and self-expression. Jesus himself warned, as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. Matthew 24 verse 37, the days of Noah, the days of giants, the days of corruption. What if our world is moving back toward the very conditions that demanded judgment in Canaan? Here it is, the truth you were never told. The destruction of the Canaanites was never about Israel versus Canaan. It was about God versus the ancient powers of darkness. It was about cutting off the roots of demonic corruption so that humanity could be saved. And the most breathtaking part? Even as God destroyed the Canaanite strongholds, he still showed mercy. Rahab, a Canaanite woman, was spared because of her faith. And from her line came Jesus Christ. That's the kind of God he is. A warrior against evil, but a redeemer for anyone who turns to him. So why did God really destroy the Canaanites? Because the battle was never about land. It was about the future of the world. It was about protecting the promise. It was about you and me, about ensuring that one day a savior would be born to crush the serpent once and for all. And if God fought that fiercely to preserve his promise back then, how much more will he fight for you today?